Hi, and welcome to the Anti-Politica channel. Today is Sunday, October 8th, 2023. It's been a while, and it's a very depressing weekend because another major war is breaking out in the Middle East. We saw horrendous and shocking violence in Israel yesterday, and the war in Ukraine is still going on, and the end is not in sight. So we thought we would make a series of videos analyzing the situation in this world gone crazy around us. We believe that the war in Ukraine is kind of the central piece in this big international puzzle. So the first thing we'll do is revisit Ukraine. We made the video a year ago, and we'll revisit our analysis and conclusions from back then, which still stand. This will be helpful in understanding what's going on in the Middle East. And we also believe that Ukraine also gives us hints as to what's going on, for example, in the relations between Canada and India, between the United States and China, and what's going on around Africa. So given that we believe that Ukraine is kind of the central piece here that helps us understand all those other issues, we'll do a video on Ukraine first. So we'll analyze and summarize the run-up to the war. We'll then take a look at the conduct of the war so far, and then we'll make predictions which still stand and are very similar to what we said 1 year ago. And then we'll talk about international consequences of this war and its likely outcome and how it explains what's going on elsewhere in the world. So in order to talk about the run-up to the war and analyze the war so far, we'll open a couple of maps. So here is a map of Ukraine showing the results of the presidential election in 2010. First off, let's go over the neighbors. So to the east and northeast and southeast, this big neighbor is, of course, Russia. To the north is Belarus, which is a Russian ally. So most of Ukraine's border is with Russia or its allies. To the west, we have NATO members, Poland. Poland is here, so this is the border with Poland. This little chunk here belongs to Slovakia. This is Hungary. This is Romania. These are all NATO members. This country in the middle between Romania and Ukraine is Moldova. This country is not part of NATO. And it's a country with lots of internal turmoil and lots of internal problems. To the south, we have the Black Sea, and this is the Crimea Peninsula. So if you look at Ukraine's elections, one after another, the pattern is just remarkably stable. The south and the east vote for pro-Russian candidates and pro-Russian parties in parliamentary elections. The center votes for nationalist Ukrainian politicians, and the extreme west of the country, this western chunk, is staunchly anti-Russian and very strongly nationalist. So the counterparts to this strongly nationalist part in the west is this eastern part and Crimea that's very staunchly pro-Russian, and Russian speakers dominate. There are lots of Russian speakers as well, and there are some Russian speakers here, but very little here. So election after election, the country turns out to be very politically divided. And if you have this kind of situation, neutrality is the only way to keep the country together and reduce internal frictions. If you try to pull this kind of country into the Western orbit, the South and the East will be very unhappy and possibly rebel. If you try to pull this country into Russia's orbit, the West and the center will be unhappy and may rebel. So the only viable option for Ukraine as a country to be stable and build prosperity and have normal political life is for these parties to meet somewhere in the middle, choose neutrality, and try to cooperate with both Russia and the West, European Union in particular. What's interesting historically, prior to this war and prior to the conflicts that started in 2014, is that this red part is slightly larger. The number of voters is slightly larger in this chunk to the south and the east of the country. So they typically were able to elect their candidates to be presidents. And oftentimes the parliament reflected the same situation. The policies that they enacted typically were sensible in the sense that they pursued neutrality and tried to trade and develop relations with both Russia and the West. And the problem with any politicians in Ukraine and the government in general is that the country is one of the most corrupt countries in the world. So even though those pro-Russian presidents and parliaments and prime ministers led sensible policies as far as neutrality and trying to develop relations with both sides, they were just incredibly corrupt, and the country's economy was never ever doing all that great, and that led to a lot of dissatisfaction and demonstrations back in 2014. And unfortunately, with help of Victoria Nuland and some neocons in Washington, D.C., those protests in 2014 were used to basically overthrow President Yanukovych and install more very staunchly pro-Western government that was basically chosen by Victoria Nuland and neocons in D.C. And what they did is they infused that government, which was basically installed by a coup. They replaced a corrupt but democratically elected politician with their own hand-picked candidates that were drawn from the most extreme, most nationalist layers of society in the West. That's very, very staunchly nationalist and very anti-Russian. And that government launched policies of de-Russifying Ukraine and basically reducing language rights of Russian speakers and trying to impose their view and their agenda on the entire country. In reaction to that coup that took place in Kiev, Russia took over the Crimean Peninsula, which was relatively easy for Russia because Crimea is almost exclusively Russian-speaking. It's very pro-Russian. And on top of that, Russia had the long-term contract with Ukraine to keep its military bases, naval bases in the city of Sevastopol and elsewhere in Crimea. So without pretty much any resistance, Russia took over Crimea as soon as the regime change in Kiev took place. And on top of that, Russia sponsored, and the local population was very receptive to the idea, uprising in these two eastern regions that basically refused to recognize the central government in Kiev, and an ugly civil war ensued. The fighting was horrendous, lots of civilian casualties, which are not sufficiently talked about in mainstream media in the West. But Ukraine had this civil war going on for years before this major war broke out. There was a peace deal negotiated with the help of France, Germany, and the EU, the so-called Minsk Accords, which were never implemented. And it turns out some of the declarations of Angela Merkel and some revelations in various conferences and various speeches revealed that neither of the sides took seriously these Minsk Accords. Ukraine basically used the truce to arm itself, preparing itself to basically resolve the situation militarily and basically defeat these two regions and make anybody who doesn't want to accept Ukrainian nationalist rule, make them leave possibly, or just stay on there as Ukrainian citizens and accept the very pro-Ukrainian nationalist policies. So that basically led to the war eventually, in which Russia stepped in, and it's a big question whether They had intelligence on the Ukrainians preparing an offensive on these two regions. Of course, each side blames the other. But that's basically the setup. Ukraine, if it were ever to be prosperous and peaceful country, had to be neutral, and it was this push toward NATO that basically is at the root of the conflict. And why did neocons in Washington, D.C. try to pull this off? Despite the low probability and unfavorable political and demographic conditions for Ukraine to become member of NATO. These people see the entire world as one large monopoly board, and they try to establish control as far as possible and eliminate any rivals that are in their way. So Russia is clearly still a rival. It's no longer a global superpower, the kind of Soviet Union was, but it's a regional player, and it's an independent country that behaves independently. And the empire and the financial and other interests cannot impose their will on Russia, and Russia needs to be weakened. And in addition to that, Ukraine is a resource-rich country, and it's a desirable piece on the monopoly board to control, because there are all these resources that could be exploited. So had this worked, Russia would have been in a very unfavorable position. Moreover, there is a famous book by Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was a national security advisor to President Carter, that famously argued that without Ukraine, Russia stops being a major power. So this was clearly the goal. And it's something that the empire was predestined to try. And this is what empires do. They expand as far as possible until they hit the wall. So this is something that the ruling class in Washington, the foreign policy establishment, was eager to try. And it seems that they tried, they gave it their best, and it didn't work. They thought that they could pull it off. They thought that Russia wasn't ready to respond. They thought that they could help Ukraine crush internal resistance in the east, and basically pull successfully Ukraine into NATO. And the interesting thing that ends up happening is, as we'll argue later, is that this seems to be backfiring in major ways. So rather than get something out of this, the neocon class may lose a great deal as a result of this adventure. So the war in Ukraine started in February of 2022. We are in the second year. And the conduct of the war is interesting and illustrates this idea that big powers, big political moves or military moves, you try certain things, and if they work, okay. If not, you go back to plan B. Once the war started, it's interesting how the Eastern Front, these two parts of these two provinces, were held by Russian or pro-Russian rebels in the beginning of the war. Crimea was also held by Russia. And it turns out that this front line between Ukraine and these breakaway provinces was really, the forces were dug in, and Ukrainian forces were really amassed in this region, probably for an offensive into these two regions, which basically gave Russia an opening to try things elsewhere. So they conquered the south, and they launched an assault on Kiev. They tried to launch an offensive on Kiev, probably hoping that the regime would collapse, and probably hoping that Zelensky and oligarchs and the Ukrainian political class would surrender if surrounded at Kiev. It turned out that they were wrong. The Ukrainian leadership and the Ukrainian army was willing to fight, and moreover, and very importantly, the West has shown real resolve to support Ukraine financially and with weapons and all kinds of shipments. So Russia tried to end the war relatively fast and at a low cost to itself, and discovered that Ukraine was a tougher nut to crack than they hoped. And they also turned out to have underestimated Western support and willingness to expand resources, whether financial or military, to prop up Ukraine. Once they realized that, and once they realized that their expedition toward Kiev or Kyiv, that these forces were kind of thin and vulnerable, they withdrew them, and they also withdrew some of the forces from other fronts to a line that they thought they could defend, this time correctly estimating that Ukraine was about to launch a counteroffensive. So they misjudged the resilience of the Ukraine's leadership and government, but then they ended up judging correctly that the Ukrainian offensive was coming, and they dug in and established a very firm front along these lines. And what's been happening ever since is that Ukraine has been attacking, trying to regain this territory, but lines haven't moved much. It's also interesting that this is turning into a war of attrition, and it's about who is going to endure longer, Ukraine and its support in the West, or Russia. And on this front, there's some worrying signs for Ukraine emerging, in the sense that Russia seems to be able to produce a great deal of military material, that is shells, ammunitions, rockets, drones, and so forth. I read somewhere an estimate that Russia is able to produce 30 to 50 drones that were developed by Iran. So they're producing those under license. So every day they can basically blow up 30 to 50 Ukrainian facilities anywhere on Ukraine's territory. In addition to that, they have huge artillery advantage over Ukraine, and it seems that one of the miscalculations by the West this time is that Russia would collapse economically and not be able to procure enough military materials needed to fight this war. On the other hand, the West seems to be depleting its reserves, and especially with things breaking out in the Middle East now, a big concern is that the West is just unable to supply Ukraine with artillery shells, tanks, missiles, and things of that nature that can match what Russia has. In addition to that, Russia has received support from countries ranging from China to North Korea and so forth, and Iran. And it seems to be having this advantage in artillery. It has advantage in the air. It has supersonic missiles that can hit anywhere in Ukraine, and has been using those. And in contrast to that, Ukraine has been trying this offensive with the relatively greater share of human resources and soldiers. And one sad aspect of this war is that Ukraine has lost lots of young men, and seems to be running out of men to fight this war. And this is worrying in the long run, because now that the offensive seems to have gone nowhere, and Russia having big artillery and other an advantage in the air and as far as technology and so forth, the worry is that Ukrainian army may collapse and that the morale may deteriorate. Ukrainians have fought very, very vigorously, and the country has put up impressive resistance, but it just seems unable to move the front lines and is running out of young men, and are now conscripting older ages, and that's becoming a big political problem inside Ukraine. On top of that, millions of people have left Ukraine and have settled in Western countries, probably found jobs, apartments, and so forth. So it's difficult to see how these people will go back to Ukraine that will be half destroyed by the time this war is over, one way or another, with lots of destroyed infrastructure and country that was poor to begin with, and now is going to be devastated by the war as a result of all this. So it's difficult to see how these people establishing comfortable lives in the West will ever go back to Ukraine. So Ukraine has things are shaping up very, very negatively for Ukraine from the demographic standpoint, and these are not good signs. So this basically leads us to consider how the story might end here. Russia has sacrificed a lot of its own young men, and has invested a great deal of resources in this war, and is probably determined to end the war in Ukraine on terms that are favorable to itself. Moreover, we see the willingness to support in the West, the willingness to support Ukraine in the West decline. So if we have political dissatisfaction inside Ukraine, if we have a demoralized, collapsing army, and if we have a reduction in the willingness of the West to support Ukraine, that may create conditions for basically Putin to impose any outcome that he sees fit. And given what he invested so far, and given the blood and treasure that Russia has invested in this war, he will probably try to maximize what he gets out of this. We stand by our predictions from before, that the minimum that Russia will end up taking is the Russian part of Ukraine, and largely Russian-speaking part of Ukraine in the south and the west. And let's try to annotate that this part of Ukraine to the south and the east, that may actually end up being assimilated into Russia as a result of this war. How far further Russia may go into Ukraine is anybody's guess. One of the cooler heads and one of the better analysts in the United States from the beginning of this war, Colonel Doug McGregor, who used to appear on Tucker Carlson on Fox News. That was his pretty much the only mainstream media place where you could hear him in the beginning of this war. But then Tucker Carlson got fired from Fox News, so you can hear Colonel McGregor on YouTube and Rumble. He thinks that this river Dnipro that runs through the middle of Ukraine is a favorable military target for Putin, because rivers are difficult to cross. They're a natural barrier to advancing armies. So if Russia and Putin want to permanently protect themselves from attacks from the Ukrainian soil, they might as well try to control this left bank of the river. So that could be an additional part that Putin may want to have his army stationed on. What will happen with the rest of Ukraine is anybody's guess. We can be pretty sure that Russia won't go unless they go completely crazy. This western part of Ukraine is very virulently nationalist, and it's not a good idea unless they go crazy and try to do something irrational. It's probably not an area into which Russia will go. Interestingly, there are some noises from the Polish side. Maybe Polish troops can come into, especially into these two regions of Ukraine that were historically parts of Poland, but that's all up in the air. It's not really clear what the arrangement for the western part of Ukraine is. And then this part is a big question mark. Will Russia try to go for this as well and maximize its prize, or will it be content to keep the pro-Russian and largely Russian-speaking south and east, in addition to the part of Ukraine that's to the northeast of the Dnipro river? So this seems very, very bleak, and it's not difficult to imagine this kind of outcome. So it would be an ultimate irony for the neocon class in Washington that basically launched this entire project in order to weaken Russia. It will be very ironic if this effort ends up being something that results in reinvigorated Russia that basically takes over much of Ukraine. And in addition to being an oil and gas giant in international markets, Russia is also a very important producer of wheat and various agricultural commodities, and so is Ukraine. Now, if you add the rich agricultural land in the south and east of Ukraine to Russia, then Russia becomes a superpower in agricultural markets, in addition to oil markets as well. Combined exports of wheat and several other agricultural products of Russia and Ukraine, and most of Ukraine's production comes from this region. If you combine those two, they exceed the exports of the US and Canada combined. So rather than weaken Russia, these neocons in Washington, D.C. Will have succeeded in making a superpower out of Russia and basically helping it recreate its empire. Its links with Belarus, which is a country to the north of Ukraine, and then if you add this chunk, Russia becomes even larger than it is now. It acquires additional resources. It dominates the entire northern coast of the Black Sea, and if you go down south in the Black Sea, you encounter Turkey. So the Russia starts to dominate the Black Sea, and this strategic port of Sebastopol here is basically geographically in the center of the Black Sea and allows Russia to project its power around that sea. So rather than weaken Russia, they'll end up strengthening Russia, and that will be the ultimate irony. So in global politics, if you play these monopoly games, sometimes you misjudge and you end up with the big disaster. And I would argue that this was predictable. They misjudged Russia's ability to produce military material. They misjudged Russia's ability to have its economy recover after sanctions were imposed on Russia. It seems that sanctions and seizing Russian assets in Western banks have not really hurt Russia all that much, while hurting the credibility of the Western banking system and the US, because now any foreign dictator, any third world country, any resource-rich country around the world that suspects that the West may not like its government at some point is now less likely to basically store its savings and capital in Western banks as a result of this move. So even that has backfired. So let me now just close this map, and we'll go back to discussing some other consequences of this outcome that's shaping shaping up in Ukraine, and it is on the horizon. While the front lines are pretty stable as of the last couple of weeks, Ukraine is deteriorating rapidly and is likely to lose this war in a major way, and the West along Ukraine will basically suffer consequences that it didn't plan for. So the recklessness and stubbornness with which the neocon class in Washington, D.C. has conducted this whole affair is puzzling and troubling. There were many points along the way at which a moral and sensible person would have stopped and reflected and reached the conclusion that some sort of negotiated settlement was way better than moving further with the project. Once it became clear that Russian economy was not going to collapse, once it became clear that Russia has a sustainable and sustained artillery advantage and air supremacy, once it became clear that tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of young Ukrainians were dying on the front without anything to show for it. Those were the times at which a rational and moral person would have concluded that it was time to negotiate. Instead of that, they are still pushing for more war, even though it's clear that it's going to eventually lead to a collapse of Ukraine as a country, and the outcome for Ukraine will be horrendous. Had the war stopped earlier, there were probably better deals to be made for Ukraine, even if they entailed some losses in eastern Ukraine and the loss of Crimea. Instead of that kind of rational and moral behavior, what we see out of Washington and out of mainstream media in the United States is this really disgusting idea that it doesn't really matter that Ukrainians are dying. No American has died, and Americans are not dying, and the support that's being sent to Ukraine doesn't cost all that much compared to the overall U.S. military budget. So it's a quote-unquote cheap way to fight Russia that completely disregards horrendous human losses on the Ukrainian side. So one irony of this whole undertaking is that Russia will actually end up being stronger rather than weakened, and it will become a bit of a strong player on the international scene rather than being marginalized. And as if that were not enough, another huge negative consequence for the United States and the West is loss of prestige, credibility, and allies. These people don't seem to realize that we live in a highly interconnected world in which information travels instantaneously. There's lots of footage, lots of exchange of ideas and experiences, and the entire world knows, and public opinion is no longer controlled by CNN and a couple of their selected media outlets. If anything, they're losing their audience, and public opinion around the world is formed on the basis of information that these people do not control, and they seem unaware of it. So people around the world have seen this kind of ultra cynical behavior in which Ukrainian lives don't matter. Ukrainian democracy or outcomes for Ukrainians don't matter at all to these people as long as they're in their mind weakening Russia. So who is going to ally with the United States and the West and NATO in the future if they see this kind of behavior? So having observed the experience of Ukraine, countries around the world are that much more reluctant to enter deals and trust the United States and NATO and the West. And we even see some worrying reactions inside NATO. If you look at the latest elections in Slovakia, that country has basically said with this election, party that's advocating peace and stopping support for Ukraine, what Slovakia is saying is, no, thank you. We don't want to be the next ones in line to fight for neocons in Washington, to fight Russia and send our young people to die. And Hungary has reached that conclusion earlier on. It seems that presence of a significant Hungarian minority inside Ukraine that kind of had a close-up view of Ukrainian nationalist government and how it treated not just Russian minority, but also other linguistic minorities. They had no illusions going into this. So Hungary was very skeptical about this war from the get-go. Now it has been joined by Slovakia in the latest election, and the next in line is Poland. And there are already noises in Poland that Poland should not follow Ukraine and continue the fight against Russia should Ukraine collapse. And being one of the willing allies in the beginning, Poland is also having second thoughts. And all these are consequences of this kind of ultra-cynical, sinister, really, really diabolical approach to international politics, which no longer flies. Whether neocons in Washington want it or not, the world is becoming multipolar. And this kind of inhumane and arrogant behavior is only going to result in lost opportunities to form alliances and cooperate with other countries that will just kind of be very, very skeptical about the US and the West in general, given what we have seen in this war in Ukraine and the behavior of Washington elites that seems completely disconnected from reality and really bloodthirsty and inhumane and willing to sacrifice other people around the world for its narrow goals that don't seem attainable in the first place. The other consequences, as we said, stronger, more assertive Russia, which will now basically go into other areas around the world, which were off limits before this. Russia wasn't strong enough, but ended up being strengthened in this war. And we already see some movements in Africa. And we'll talk about how this war may be already affecting the Middle East and the Arab world, which seems to be reacting to the newly formed situation in the world that's visibly becoming multipolar, and the West rapidly losing its prestige and military dominance. Third consequence is that Russia, in cooperation with China and Iran and other countries that were probably on the list to topple their regimes, have cooperated and now have established BRICS, and Brazil has joined, and other important countries around the world have joined the BRICS system, trying to basically preempt further misuse of the global financial system by the United States and its allies as a weapon to enforce quote-unquote discipline around the world. So having imposed sanctions on Russia and having used the international payment system as a weapon of war, many countries around the world are realizing, gee, if at some point the United States doesn't like what we do or tries to force us to do something that we don't want to do, if we were to successfully resist that kind of pressure, we'd better have an alternative payment system. So the development of BRICS, the de-dollarization of the world, return to gold and other alternative methods of international payments is a huge danger and may end up being one of the major downsides of this entire offensive and trying to get closer to Moscow by pulling Ukraine into NATO. So this will be a major setback as a result, and the major unintended consequence of this war. And one final thought, which is really frightening, given the way this war is going, and given how Russia was in a favorable position to innovate in this war. war. The military technology is undergoing a big revolution with drones and all kinds of other new technologies. One worrying aspect that we haven't seen discussed all that much is that it seems that the close combat experience near its borders and near its military facilities and factories has allowed Russia to absorb technologies from Iran and elsewhere that were given to it and cooperate with those allies. But in addition to that, having this kind of close experience with this war of a new generation, Russia seems to be able to ramp up its production of artillery and other pieces, but then also to innovate with drones and other technologies. Western world, by fighting through proxy of Ukraine with the front line that's very, very remote from its R&D centers and military material production facilities, is not able to innovate as efficiently. And if you try to establish any kind of military production on Ukraine's soil or have some kind of R&D centers, you can be sure that they will be hit pretty soon by Russian hypersonic missiles that they cannot defend against. So one worrying aspect of this is that this military victory will give Russia extraordinary military capabilities in the new generation of warfare. So this will be a major, major backfiring of this entire project on the Western world. And it could be that what we see around Africa and what we see elsewhere around the world is a consequence of this. So great job, Neocons. You really, really did it this time. And one has to wonder what kind of disaster these people need to cause besides Iraq and Afghanistan and now Ukraine. What other kind of big, big disaster do these people need to cause before they start losing their jobs and influence in Washington, D.C.? So with that thought, we'll stop here, and then our future videos will talk about the Middle East and other issues around the world. So thank you. We'll see you soon.